Not to you, man. The alarm had been going for 40 seconds when Nurse Tessa Colquhoun drove her palms into the man's sternum for the 11th time, and she was counting because counting was the only thing keeping her hands steady. Come in through the ambulance bay at 6:14 in the morning. No ID, no next of kin listed, a construction jacket still on him when the paramedics rolled him through the doors. Cardiac arrest, probable cause unknown. The overnight resident had called it and stepped back, and Tessa had moved in without thinking about it, the way she always did, the way 3 years in the cardiac ward at St. Cred. Agatha's health center in Burlington, Ontario had trained her to move, fast and certain, and without waiting for someone to tell her it was her turn. She was on compression to 11. When the doors at the far end of the corridor swung open, she didn't look up. She rarely looked up during compressions. You learned that early, or you learned it too late. The moment your eyes left the patient was the moment everything else started to feel more real than the person under your hands. Nurse. The voice came from somewhere behind her left shoulder. Not a doctor's voice. Too flat, too controlled. We need to move him. Resuscitation, she said. She didn't stop. Spoke, I'm aware of what you're doing. I need you to stop. She looked up then. Months again. The man standing in the corridor doorway was wearing a gray suit that cost more than her monthly car payment. His name was Gordon Whitfield, and he was the chief executive officer of Allerant Health Systems, the private management company that had taken over St. Agatha's 14 months ago. I've seen him twice. Once at an all-staff address in the auditorium where he'd talked about operational excellence for 45 minutes, and once in the parking structure where he'd been irritated that someone had taken his reserved spot. Both times he had looked like a man who was very accustomed to rooms reorganizing themselves around his arrival. Behind him in the corridor, she could see 4 people in business attire. She recognized the woman closest to the door from the news. Margot Stein, who sat on the board of a real estate investment trust that was, according to the staff rumor mill, considering a significant capital partnership with Allerant. Move him where? Tessa said. It wasn't really a question. People in the south spoke. There's a room available in the south wing. The team there can continue. Team there. It's a Snohun. It's a storage corridor. Scumbered. Whitfield's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Nurse, I'd ask you to be aware that we have guests in the building today, and the emergency department is... This man is in cardiac arrest. She pressed down again. I'm not moving him. For a moment, no one spoke. The monitor beeped. The automatic blood pressure cuff on the wall cycled. Tessa kept counting. Mine hots. Then, Whitfield stepped forward and put his hand on her shoulder. Mia Faraday. She stopped. Not because she was afraid of him. Not because she thought he had any authority over the 30 centimeters between her hands and this man's chest. She stopped. Because she was so startled by the physical reality of it. A CEO's hand on a nurse's shoulder in the middle of a code that her body simply paused before her brain could override it. Janine, step back, he said. The South Wing team will take over. There is no South Wing team, she said again very quietly. There is no code team assigned to the South Wing. If you move this patient now, he dies. Dawn. Whitfield glanced back at the investors through the window, then back at her. I'll accept that clinical outcome, he said. Dawn's non-Brivenson. She would think about those 5 words for a long time afterward. I'll accept that clinical outcome, the way he said it with the same tone you'd use to approve a quarterly projection. The way his eyes had moved to the investors before he said it, as if he were managing the optics of a presentation, rather than making a decision about whether a person lived. Calmed ear, she went back to compressions. He told that if she did not step away from the patient immediately, she would be suspended. Pending review, she kept going. He told her that her actions constituted insubordination, and that she she should be aware of the consequences. She kept going. On the 23rd compression, the defibrillator charged and the resident called clear. And she stepped back exactly long enough for the shock. And then she went back in. On the 31st compression, the monitor shifted. Nurse rhythm, faint, unsteady, but there. The resident let out a long breath. One of the nurses behind Tessa said something quiet. Tessa stood back and stripped off her gloves and didn't say anything at all. Whitfield was gone. Spoke. She received the suspension notice at 8:55 that morning, delivered via email to her hospital account while she was still charting at the nurse's station. Pending review. Effective immediately. She was asked to return her access badge to security before leaving the building. Fergie. Tessa sat in the small room they used for shift handovers and read the email twice. Then she read the patient's chart, which showed that he was stable, that he had been moved to the cardiac ICU, and that his name was still listed as unknown. 9 spoke. She handed over her badge. The security guard, a man named Fuad who had worked the morning shift at St. Agatha's for 11 years and knew every nurse on the cardiac ward by name, did not make eye contact when he took it. Home took 22 minutes. The February roads were gray and flat, and the radio played. Something Tessa didn't register. She lived in a one-bedroom apartment in Aldershot, which she'd chosen because it was close to the hospital and had a parking spot included, and she had not, at 29, imagined staying there long enough for it to matter. She was 33 now. She sat in her car in the parking lot for a while before going in. She made tea she didn't drink, and stood at her kitchen window and looked at the parking lot and thought about the way Whitfield's hand had felt on her shoulder. Not heavy, just present, just real. The specific physical weight of being told that you are wrong and that someone else has decided what the correct outcome is. About Tzvik. She thought about the patient. She didn't know his name. She knew his rhythm, the resistance of his sternum, the particular way the monitor had shifted from flatline to something faint and alive. She knew that he was alive because she had kept going. That was the part she kept returning to, not the suspension, not the email she'd handed to Fuad, who wouldn't meet her eyes. Just the simple arithmetic of what had happened. She had kept going. He had lived. Man? She called her union rep at 10:30. The call went to voicemail. She left a message that she thought was reasonably calm, and then she made more tea and sat down with the suspension notice and a yellow notepad and started writing down everything she remembered, in order, with times. And she had 14 pages by noon. The patient's name was Marcus Devereaux, and she found that out 3 days later, not from the hospital, but from a woman who knocked on her apartment door at 7 in the evening and introduced herself as Dr. Nadia Ouellet. Dr. Ouellet was small and precise-looking, with short graying hair and the particular kind of stillness that Tessa associated with people who had spent a great deal of their professional lives making high-stakes decisions in low-information environments. She was wearing civilian clothes, dark slacks, a fleece vest, but she held herself like someone who was accustomed to uniforms. Minton, I'm with the Inspector General's office, she said. Canadian Forces. I'd like to talk to you about what happened on the 8th. In the doorway. Tessa stepped back from the doorway. Come in. Come in. Dr. Ouellet sat at the kitchen table and accepted tea, and did not drink it, and explained, in a measured and unhurried way, that Marcus Devereaux was a chief warrant officer with the Joint Task Force 2, Canada's Special Operations Unit, that he had been in Burlington visiting family, that the cardiac event had been related to a service-connected condition that had been insufficiently documented in his transition records, and that his commanding officer had been made aware of the incident at St. Myron spoke. Agatha's, including the specific circumstances of his resuscitation. At his commanding officer, Tessa said. Gear? Colonel James Rutherford. He asked me to speak with you directly. I looked at her. Is Chief Warrant Officer Devereaux going to be all right? He's recovering. He's been transferred to the cardiac unit at Hamilton General. His prognosis is good. Dr. Ouellette paused. Largely because of what you did. And nodded. She didn't say anything. Spoke. I'd like to hear your account of what happened. All of it, including what Mr. Whitfield said to you. Dr. Ouellette had a small recorder on the table. And I'd like, if you have them, any notes you made afterward. Tessa reached for the yellow notepad. Ma'am. She didn't hear from the hospital for another 4 days. She heard from her union rep. Eventually, a woman named Carol, who apologized for the delay and said she'd been in mediation on a separate file, and that Tessa's situation was, in her professional assessment, extremely straightforward, and that they would be filing a formal grievance and requesting immediate reinstatement. Tessa had told Carol about the Inspector General's office. Carol had been quiet for a moment and then said, Well, I'm on it at gear. That changes the shape of this considerably. At home. On the 6th day after the suspension, Tessa went for a run along the Lakeshore Trail because she had stopped being able to sit in her apartment without her thoughts moving in tight circles. The ice was still on the edge of the lake, and the sky was low and white, and the trail was mostly empty. She ran until she was too tired to think clearly, and then she walked home. There was a voicemail on her phone from a number she didn't recognize. She listened to it, standing in the parking lot, still in her running clothes, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, named Raymond Marmidian. It was not from the hospital. It was from a lawyer named Raymond T.S.E., who identified himself as representing a group of investors who had been present at St. Agatha's on the morning of February 8th, and who wished to speak with her at her earliest convenience. She went inside and looked at the ceiling for a while. Then she called Raymond T.S.E. back, that at least one of the investors who had been in the corridor that morning. A woman named Croft, who ran a family foundation focused on healthcare infrastructure, had seen enough to be troubled, and in a vague, private way. Troubled in the specific way of a person who sits on several boards and understands exactly what the phrase, I'll accept that clinical outcome, means in a legal context. She left St. Agatha's that morning and called her lawyer before she'd reached the parking structure. She had notes. She had photographs she'd taken on her phone, which she had not realized. She was taking until she looked at her camera roll later. The corridor, the window, the shape of Whitfield's hand on Tessa's shoulder visible through the glass. And smooned. Raymond explained all of this calmly and asked if Tessa would be willing to speak with Croft directly. Tessa said yes. The conversation happened the following afternoon on a video call, and Croft was not what Tessa expected. She was in her 60s, straightforward and clearly furious in the quiet, organized way of someone who has been furious before and knows how to make it useful. Automated rifles spoke. I want you to know, Croft said, that no one in that group would have invested $1 in that building after what we saw, and that I have made that very clear to the board. I appreciate that, Tessa said. What he said to you about the clinical outcome, Croft paused. I've been in a lot of boardrooms. I've heard a lot of things said about cost and liability and acceptable risk. I have never heard anyone say that about a person who was dying in front of them. She paused again. I wanted you to know that someone was there and saw it, and is not going to let it be quietly buried in a review process. Ended, Tessa sat at her kitchen table for a long time. She thought about the fact that until this moment, she had not entirely been certain that she had not imagined it. The specific words The specific calm of his voice, the way his eyes had gone to the investors before he said them. Memory under stress was unreliable. She'd told herself that. But Croft had heard it too. The Ontario Ministry of Health opened a formal review of St. Agatha's emergency protocols on February 18th. The review had been requested jointly by the Inspector General's office on the basis of concerns regarding a Canadian Forces member's care, and by 3 members of the hospital's board of directors who had received a letter from Croft the previous week. Dronchard spoke. Whitfield was placed on administrative leave pending the outcome. About it, a soldier spoke. Tessa found out about it from Carol, who called her on a Tuesday morning with a tone of voice that suggested she had been waiting to make this call for some time. Reinstatement effective March 1st, Carol said. Full back pay. And they've asked whether you'd be available to meet with the review committee. What kind of meeting? And soldier spoke. They want your account of February 8th, the whole sequence. They're also. Carol paused. There's a second conversation they'd like to have, about the ward, about what structural changes might look like. Spoke. Tessa was quiet for a moment. Outside her window, the lake trail was still icy, but the light was different, less flat, more angled, the particular quality of February, tipping toward March even when it was still cold. I'll meet with the review committee, she said. Both conversations. Beginning. She went back to work on a Wednesday, which was not the first of the month, but close enough that it felt like a beginning. The morning shift started at 7. She arrived at 6:45, which was normal for her. Mrs. Graymond. Fuad was at the security desk. When she came through the main doors, he looked up and nodded at her with a small, careful nod that said several things without saying any of them, and she nodded back. Her room and changed and checked the board, and found she was assigned to cardiac, which was also her ward, which was also normal. Everything was very normal. The cart was where it always was. The supply room had the same broken hinge on the second cabinet door that had been broken since October. Natter spoke. The overnight resident, a young man named Travers, who looked as if he had not slept since sometime in late January, gave her the most thorough verbal handover of the 3 patients he handed over, and then thanked her, without explaining what for, and went home. Mr. She was checking the first chart when one of the other nurses, on shift a woman named Adiola, who had been at St. Agatha's 6 years longer than Tessa, and had once described her own professional philosophy as, "Don't argue with me about basic human dignity. I have been tired longer than you," stopped beside her and said, "Glad you're back." "You'll be back," Tessa said. She meant it in a very plain way, not the large way, not some statement about purpose or vindication, just the plain, immediate fact of having work to do and knowing how to do it. Mention. The first patient was a 68-year-old man named Kowalski who was post-bypass day 3 and was worried about whether his dog was being fed. Tessa told him that his daughter had confirmed the dog was being fed and also walked twice daily, which Kowalski accepted with the specific skepticism of a man who loves his dog very much and does not entirely trust reports about it. On to the second patient was asleep. To the Dovard Bizet vid Marcus Dever. She stood in the doorway for a moment before going in. She had not known he'd been transferred back from Hamilton, and seeing him there was different from having expected it. He was sitting up slightly, reading something on a tablet, looking considerably more alive than he had on February 8th. Registered. He was heavier, broader in the shoulders, with the particular quality of stillness that she'd come to associate, after 3 years on cardiac, with people who had been genuinely close and had come back from it. From a notcher, he looked up. "You're the nurse," he said. "I am," she said. She came into the room and checked the monitor and updated the chart. "How are you feeling?" "From the last time you saw me." He set the tablet down. Dr. Ouellette told me what happened, what you did. My job, Tessa said. Blizzard, she also told me what it cost you. Won't mean. Tessa didn't say anything for a moment. She wrote down the morning vitals. Mindy, it was temporary, she said eventually. I'm back now. Maid. Devereaux looked at her with the particular attentiveness of someone who has spent a great deal of time around other people under pressure and has learned to actually look at them. Colonel Rutherford wants to come by today, he said. He'd like to meet you, if you're willing. He doesn't need to do that. I'm going to do it anyway. He just wanted me to ask if you were willing. Devereaux paused. He's not really asking. Anne. Colonel James Rutherford arrived at 2 in the afternoon and was not what she expected. In the way that she was beginning to think, the people attached to this situation were consistently not what she expected. Now Majin Glow, he was in civilian clothes like Dr. Ouellette had been Vermont gear, and he was somewhere in his late 50s and looked like a man who had organized large and difficult things for a very long time, and had developed a kind of permanent, efficient patience from doing it. He did not make a speech. He thanked her plainly and directly, the way you thank someone when you mean it and don't have any particular rhetorical objective beyond that. She told him it was not necessary. He said he understood that and thanked her again. Then he said, I understand there's a review process underway. I've been told they're looking at systemic changes to the emergency protocol. How patients in critical condition are managed during hospital events and administrative activities. Of it, Tessa said. Rutherford looked at her steadily. If you're speaking with that committee, I'd ask you to push on the question of authority. Who has clinical override in a code situation? It needs to be in writing, it needs to be non-negotiable, and it needs to have teeth. He paused. What happened here? An administrator physically intervening in active resuscitation should not be a gray area. It ain't a gray area clinically, Tessa said. No, but it clearly was administratively. He looked at her. That's what needs to change. That afterward, when he was gone, and she was back at the nurse's station, finishing her afternoon charts, she thought about what it meant to have a thing be true clinically and contested administratively. She had known on the morning of February 8th that she was right. She had not stopped for even a fraction of a second in her certainty that she was right. But she had also had a CEO's hand on her shoulder and a suspension notice in her inbox by 9. And those things were also real, and they were real, because the system had room for them. That was the part she wanted to change. Notcher spoke. She met with the review committee on the 17th of March on a Tuesday afternoon that had finally, grudgingly, turned toward something approximating spring, the kind of cold, bright Ontario March day where you could see the light changing even if you couldn't quite feel it yet. Main spoke. The committee room was on the 4th floor, with a window that faced the parking structure, and not the lake, which seemed like a minor planning failure. There were 6 people at the table. A deputy minister, 2 hospital administrators from other networks, a physician representative from the Ontario Medical Association, a patient advocate, and at the far end of the table, Dr. Ouellette, who had not identified herself as part of the committee when they'd met in Tessa's apartment, and who gave Tessa the faintest nod when she came in. Mate. Tessa had her yellow notepad. She had made a second copy of everything. Convenient. She told them the sequence of events from February 8th. She told them what Whitfield had said, including the 5 words. She told them about the hand on her shoulder. She was precise and linear, and she did not editorialize, because she had learned over 3 years of writing incident reports that the facts were almost always more effective than the commentary. Inez spoke. Then the patient advocate, a woman named Tran, asked, "What would you want the outcome of this review to be? Not in terms of personnel, in terms of the system." The mayor spoke. Tessa had thought about this. She had been thinking about it since Rutherford had said, "That's what needs to change in Devereaux's room." And she had said it out loud to herself several times in her apartment to hear how it sounded. The woman had spoke. "I want a clear written protocol establishing that clinical authority in a code situation is non-delegable," she said. "I want it to apply regardless of what administrative event is occurring in the building. To include specific language about physical interference with resuscitation constituting a reportable incident. And I want that protocol posted visibly in every emergency treatment area in every facility under this network." The minister wrote something down. "And I want," she said, "a mandatory annual training for all administrative staff, including C-suite, on what a code situation means and what their role in it is, which is to stay out of the way." D. Tran was writing too. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where people are paying attention. "At St. Agatha's on February 8th, Tessa said, "is not a personnel failure in isolation. It's evidence of a structural gap that will produce the same outcome again if it's not addressed. You can remove one administrator. You cannot remove the conditions that allowed that administrator to believe he had authority in that room." In her notepad, the Fuchsan read what happened 4 days ago. She had said in that room, meaning the 8th. What happened exposed a structural failure. And you can't fix a structural failure with a personnel change at the top. Whitfield was terminated. The termination was announced in a brief statement from the Allerant Health Systems Board that used the phrase "values misalignment" 4 times and did not mention cardiac arrest, clinical outcomes, or the hand on a nurse's shoulder. The protocol Tessa had described was introduced as part of a new patient care standard across 7 Ontario facilities. It was, the Deputy Minister's office noted in the announcement, one of the most specific and enforceable clinical authority frameworks in the province. On a Wednesday morning, the same way she heard about most things that mattered at St. Agatha's. From Adiola, who came to find her in the supply room where she was counting IV bags and said, "Have you seen the memo?" Tessa had not seen the memo. Adiola handed her the paper copy. Everyone read it twice. She stood there with the IV bags, half-counted, and read it twice. Spoke. And the supply room was quiet and fluorescent lit, and smelled like the particular combination of plastic packaging and disinfectant that she had spent 4 years walking in and out of without thinking about February 8th, the 14th compression. The hand on her shoulder, the 5 words said in a boardroom voice, in a room where someone was dying. And she thought about the particular feeling of going back to compressions anyway. About Kowalski, who was home now with his dog. She thought about Devereaux, who had walked out of the hospital on his own 2 feet and saluted Fuad on the way through the lobby which Fuad had mentioned to her with great satisfaction. She folded the memo and put it in her scrubs pocket. Then she finished counting the IV bags, because there was still a full shift ahead of her, and the work was what it always had been. Not a statement, not a victory lap, just the necessary, unglamorous, irreplaceable fact of showing up and doing it right. I keep thinking about the moment Tessa went back to compressions. Not the suspension, not the memo, not the protocol that got posted in 7 hospitals across the province. Just that one moment. Whitfield's hand on her shoulder, 5 words said in a boardroom voice, and then her hands going back down anyway. Compression 23, 24, 25. There's a version of this story where she stops, where the weight of his authority, his suit, his investors in the corridor is enough to make her hands go still. Most people, I think, would not blame her for that version. The system was enormous. She was one nurse on a morning shift in Burlington. Stopping would have been the path of least damage to herself. She knew exactly what continuing would cost her. And she continued anyway. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing. What me most is that her integrity wasn't dramatic. It didn't announce itself. She didn't make a speech. She just kept going, counted her compressions, and let the work speak. I think that's what real moral courage actually looks like, from the inside. Not a feeling of heroism, but a feeling of simple clarity. This is wrong. I know what right looks like. My hands know what to do. Many smoke. And then there's what she did afterward, which I think gets underestimated. She didn't just survive the situation. She sat down with a yellow notepad and wrote 14 pages of notes from memory, precise and timed. Because she understood that what had happened needed to be documented accurately if it was ever going to matter beyond that one morning. And kind of strength, the unglamorous, patient kind that shows up not in the crisis, but in the hours after, when the adrenaline is gone and you're alone in your apartment with cold tea and a legal pad. She used her mind carefully when it would have been easier to just be angry. Not mean. What Whitfield got wrong, what people like Whitfield always get wrong, is the assumption that authority is the same as being right. He had the title, the suit, the investors, the suspension process. He had every institutional lever. What he didn't have was a sound case, and eventually the facts of the matter, a soldier alive in the cardiac ICU, a photograph on a phone, a foundation director who'd sat in enough boardrooms to know exactly what she'd witnessed. Those facts outlasted every institutional lever he had. That's not luck. What happens when someone does the right thing with enough precision and enough persistence that the truth becomes impossible to manage away. As Rifle spoke. I think about the three things this story keeps coming back to. Knowing what's right and doing it anyway. Thinking clearly enough to document and articulate it, and it long enough for the system to catch up. None of those things are glamorous. None of those things are glamorous. None of them happened in a single moment. Compression by compression, page by page, meeting by meeting. Until the result was a protocol posted on the wall of every emergency department in the network. She finished counting the IV bags and went back to her shift. That's the ending. I find it more satisfying than any other kind.